Welcome everyone to this 1 hour webinar all about advising on net zero for clients, the opportunities and the threats. We're delighted to mention, that so many of you have an interest in this increasingly important topic, and thank you for joining us. My name is Fiona Donnelly, and I am Director of Sustainability at the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Scotland, or ICAS, as we're also fond of being called. We're an educator of new CAs, and currently some 3,000 people are taking our CA qualification. We're also a regulator of some 24,000 members, just over a third of whom are in Scotland, about a fifth are SMEs. And we're also a professional body having a voice in shaping the direction of the profession. So we're quite an unusual animal and have a different role in the financial services ecosystem. So while the last few log in, let me just cover the usual housekeeping matters. We are going to present to you, but we're also warmly welcome your questions, which you can post at any time during the session by using the live Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Submit your questions anonymously if you want, and we will answer as many as we can at the end of the session. If you want to have a chat among yourselves and not hang on to our every word, that's totally okay too. And you are able to use the discussion forum, which is another button towards the right-hand side of the bottom of your screen. So there you can comment or discuss on matters with your fellow attendees. Third thing is we're now recording the session. We're recording this so that you can enjoy the session again later or even share it with your colleagues and friends. The slides that we will show today, they're actually very information rich. We've got lots of links on the slides today, so please do download them from icas.com/webinars after the event. And don't worry if you are tuning in from somewhere noisy, if you've got background noise, no problem at all. We have muted you, so enjoy what we're saying. Don't worry about the background noise. So it's my pleasure to host you today. We will be joined by two speakers. Craig Anderson is my colleague at ICAS. He is Facilities Manager here since January 2019. And quite frankly, what Craig doesn't know about net zero at ICAS is just really not worth knowing. He's been involved in measuring and reporting the ICAS GHG data, involved in developing the roadmap, and dealing with the external contractors and internal teams to effect impactful change. Then from outside ICAS, we have the pleasure of Tony Greenham, who is ESG Director with the British Business Bank, and we're allowed to call them BBB. He is a director in the Impact and Insights team and is focused on delivering the bank's objective to support the UK's transition to net zero economy. It's a very interesting organisation, and I'm not going to say any more about the bank, but I invite you to really listen to when Tony makes his introduction. Tony himself has a really interesting, diverse background in the Big Four, in equity capital markets with Barclays and Credit Suisse, as well as being an FD with an SME. So he's got lots of insights to bring to our conversation today. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. We do have a busy hour, an ambitious agenda, covering 4 areas. Just to remind you, we've got we're going to go through the basics of net zero and carbon accounting and a very, very quick oversight and refresher, if you like. We'll also just have a look at why things like carbon and broader ESG matters are important in business decisions. Then we'll look at SMEs and why you should take action and how the bank can help. And then we'll also share a wee bit about ICAS's own net zero journey. So it's a busy hour, but let's see how we go. Please, as I say, feed in any questions at any time. But we feel that the session today is actually incredibly well timed. You know, just now we have had a horrible summer weather-wise, and as the World Meteorological Organization said last week, this has been the hottest on record. I think we all suspected that for some time, but they actually confirmed by data this was the case. We referred to the IPCC in the event flyer for this event, and basically that's the collective of the world's leading climate scientists, and they were just flagging how exactly what's happened. Basically, every corner of the world is feeling climate change, and more severe impacts are in store if we do not make changes to the greenhouse gas emissions. And in a way, we kind of knew this was coming down the line 7 years ago when the Paris Agreement was signed, and we set the goal of halving emissions by 2030. So here we are, 7 years into that timeline with 7 years to go. So how are we doing? Let's have a reflection on that today as well. But before I pass over to the gents, we thought it'd be interesting just to have a bit of a poll of the attendees. You know how these things work. It's just a quick sort of temperature check. We just thought it'd be interesting to see, few people find addressing net zero to be an easy thing. So we thought it'd be interesting just to learn from each other and get you to share what is your biggest barrier. You've got 5 choices there. You're all invited to pick one. Give you a few seconds there just to have a bit of a think. There's obviously no right or wrong. It's just what's front of mind just now with your biggest barrier transitioning your business to become net zero. A few options there. It's interesting when you actually poll people and you compare that to maybe some of the reports that you've read, like what is the reality in a particular segment of the market. Have you all had a chance to think? Still a few people coming in. I think that's settled now. Shall we draw the line there? So there we go. What's that? Almost 40% consider you have higher and more business critical priorities. I think in this market, that's not an entirely big surprise given the pressures of cost of living and budgetary pressures. But maybe after today, we'll maybe have you rethinking, reflecting on that, and maybe considering that climate change is indeed a very important and business critical priority. Let's see how we go. But thank you for your sharing. That's great. I think without any further ado, I will pass over to Tony, who will pick up and tell us all about his work with the BBB. Over to you, Tony.
Thank you, Fiona, and it's a pleasure to be here today to discuss these topics with you. Thanks for having me. That poll was very interesting. Perhaps we'll come back to it at the end, but I think this is something we come up against often. And as you mentioned, I've been a director of a small business and a member of the Federation of Small Businesses, so I have seen life at both ends of the business spectrum. And perhaps it's the difference between important and urgent, because during tricky economic times, as a small business owner, the day-to-day realities of running a small business are intense, and I know that. But I think climate change is one of these slowly unfolding crises that is nevertheless still a crisis. And I think that perhaps if we can encourage business owners to incorporate it into their planning, into their thinking about what products they're going to do next, into sort of their thinking for the upcoming year, 2 to 5 years, that's going to be really important. So I think I'm not surprised that so many people right now find it difficult to prioritize action on carbon and climate change. But hopefully the presentation will both give some encouragement to do so and also some pointers about where to start, perhaps. So let me get into the slides and look forward to discussion later on as well. So I'm just going to cover a brief introduction to the British Business Bank and then a little bit more about why really we should be taking action and we should be encouraging our clients to take action. Cover a little bit of carbon accounting and sustainability reporting, which given this audience, hopefully is a topic that you're already a little bit into and would be certainly interested in. And then really focus on what this means for smaller businesses. So first of all, who are we? Well, if you haven't heard of us, we are the government's economic development bank. So we are an arm's length body of government. We operate independently, but we deliver on government policy. And our mission is to drive sustainable growth and prosperity across the UK and to enable the transition to a net zero economy by improving access to finance for smaller businesses. Now, how do we do that? We we don't lend directly, we don't invest directly. We work with over 218, the number keeps changing every month, but it's around about that, delivery partners, which range from venture capital firms and business angel groups through to small asset finance companies, all the way up to some of the challenger banks that we work with. And so we have a range of products I'll come on to, but we basically are there to try and expand the quantity of finance available to make sure that the needs of small businesses are met throughout the UK. We have a number of strategic objectives. Well, we have 4 of them. Here they are. Driving sustainable business growth, which really is the starting point of making sure that businesses have access to the finance they need. But also we have an objective to make sure that innovation gets the finance it needs, because often that's high risk, finance that is more difficult to obtain. And then we have 2 objectives which are really very high on the sort of social impact side, which is unlocking potential. So this is making sure that it shouldn't matter who you are or where you are in the UK. As an entrepreneur, you should have equal access to the finance you need. So this is about making sure that finance is available throughout all of the communities in the UK. And then last but not least, building the modern green economy, which we'll talk a lot more about during the course of this presentation. And so we can move on to the next slide. There it is. What sort of quantity we're talking about? Well, we support over 12 billion of finance. Some of that is on our balance sheet, about 4 billion, but other is through guarantees that we operate on behalf, loan guarantees we operate on behalf of the government. And also we leverage in private money alongside the public money that we deploy. And that adds up to, it's actually now over 100,000 businesses that have been supported through finance because of the finance that we've made available. Just very briefly overview of our programs, but I do encourage you to sort of have a browse to the website and get into any that sound more interesting. But we think about 3 phases of business: startup, scale up, and stay ahead. And we have a product in each of those categories. For the startup, our startup loans product is one which we are very keen of. As over 25,000 of these, I think, have now been made in Scotland alone. From that point of view, these are loans which, unlike most banks, this is a loan which is able to be made to a brand new startup, so no trading record required, on a fixed rate of interest of 6% plus 1% fee. I won't go into the detail of the other products so much, but that one I do like to point out for anybody that has clients come to them saying, I want to start a new business, who will lend me the money? So look up, there's a website just for startup loans, and that's operated through various delivery partners throughout the UK. And then we have various equity and debt programs to help businesses expand, that young businesses to grow, and then established businesses, various loan products to help them to stay ahead and invest. Now, we also, alongside all of that, have regional and national funds. Now, the exciting news here is that we've operated a number of regional funds in England, which were focused in areas which were particularly in need, with high levels of economic deprivation. But we're now launching a new £1.6 billion programme, which is across all the nations as well as English regions. And that means that there is a new Scotland fund with £150 million that will have both the ability to invest in equity and venture debt and smaller scale loans as well, of £150 million across Scotland. That we hope to be launching in later in the autumn. So keep your eyes peeled for that. We're just in the process of appointing the delivery partners that will help us to deploy that capital. Worth saying that actually in those funds we've built in high levels of consideration of environmental social governance factors in the selection both of the delivery partners and of ultimately the loans. Now, why the case for action? Why would we do that? Well, this graphic I think is very powerful in summing up what has happened actually by coincidence over my lifetime. So this is since 1970 when I was born. And it shows global warming across the top, and the gradually deepening red temperatures show the change in temperature. We're now at 1.2, 1.3 degrees centigrade increase over pre-industrial average. But I also included the bottom one, which is they're known as the biodiversity stripes. And that also shows another critical environmental challenge, which is the loss of species and biodiversity globally. Part of that is interrelated with climate change. And that has all sorts of important ramifications for food production and as well as impacting back on the climate as well. So this is, this is real, this is happening now, it's taking effect now. And these are serious issues that collectively we must solve. How big is this problem? Well, bear with me. The next three slides are quite rich in content, as Fiona said. I'm not going to go through the detail all of them, but I wanted to include them so that if you wanted to come back and look at them, then please do. But this was prepared for us by PwC, as it happens. And it just shows that there's a pathway there in the red line with the dotted line, which is business as usual. The sort of decarbonisation we've been doing in our economy has been about 1.4% a year. So every year we use 1.4% less carbon for producing the same quantity of economic output. Well, that's good. So we have been decarbonising, right? But it's not good enough, because if we're going to hit our targets to keep global warming within 2 degrees, we now need to start decarbonising at almost 9 to 10% a year. And to do that, actually to hit 1.5, it's even faster. Now, these are enormous changes in the sort of way that we produce and distribute goods throughout the economy. Huge revolution in energy, clean energy required to hit these numbers. And so this creates both threats and opportunities for businesses, as we'll come on to. Now, are we on track to hit the numbers? Globally, no, is the short answer. So I'm only going to point to 2 figures here, really, which are the bar on the left, which is the blue one that has 2.7 degrees in the middle. If all the governments around the world just carry on with their current policies, we are heading towards 2.7 degrees of global warming by the end of this century. That would be disastrous. So hopefully, gradually, governments are including better policies and taking more action, including our own. Now, if all of the current sort of actions were taken by governments, on the most optimistic scenario, we could just about get there. And the middle of the bar on the right is 1.8 degrees, which is not good news, but it is at least keeping within that all-important 2 degrees. So I think encouraging signs here are, the scale of action elsewhere. So the US Inflation Reduction Act is over $780 billion odd of investment in clean energy, in electric vehicles, and all sorts of other investments in the economy to decarbonize that's happening in the States. In China, often pointed to as one of the biggest polluters, and they are, but they're also, in the first quarter of this year, installed more renewable energy capacity than the rest of the world combined. So, big action is being taken around the world. So there are reasons to be hopeful. What about in the UK? Well, we're not on track. We're not on track to meet our targets. What this is the Climate Change Committee produces an annual report. And these 3 bars here are the 3 5-year carbon budgets that have been set. The top circle along there is sort of business as usual in terms of total carbon emissions. What we need to do is the bottom dark circle, which, as you can see, is gradually going down. And what the coloured bars in between show is how much of that gap between the high blob and the low blob we have policies in place for. So green means we've got good, credible policies in place to make that reduction, but yellow is at risk. The amber is a significant risk, and where it's red, there is no credible plans currently in place. Now, this is the government's independent climate change committee assessment. Now, what do I take from that? The British Business Bank doesn't make policy, we implement it. But one could assume, if one were in business, that this might mean that we'll see yet more policies, hopefully maybe some incentives for business, but there might be other regulations, there might be other changes coming in that is going to close that gap. So this is the really key message of this slide is the goalposts are always moving when it comes to the progress of the economy towards decarbonisation. It's an ever-changing situation, and I'm afraid, but businesses are good at responding to change. I think that's one of the things that businesses are exceptionally good at, better than governments, arguably. So it's an ever-changing scenario, and we just have to get used to that. Now, carbon accounting. There's a lot on this slide, but I wanted to leave this. If you haven't already come across it, you will inevitably in your professional lives be dealing with this. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol method of calculating the carbon emissions of a company or an entity, and it's the Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions that you may have heard of, may already be calculating indeed. And Craig, I'm sure, can tell us a lot about this. But I'm not going to go through all of the parts of that, but I think it's worth pointing out that Scope 1, which is the emissions you directly produce out of your own vehicles and your own building, and Scope 2, which is the emissions from the electricity that you consume, are in a way the easier ones to measure and control. But for most businesses, it's the Scope 3. It's all of the emissions from your supply chain and all of the emissions from your products as used by your customers. That's where the big numbers are, and that's a little bit more difficult to think about and measure. And for financial institutions like us and like banks and venture capital firms and what have you, the really big number is what's known as Scope 315, which is financed emissions. It's the emissions that come from as a result of the loans or the investments that you've made. And that's why we're seeing financial institutions that now have to report on this and set credible plans to reduce their emissions, including their Scope 3. We're now seeing that banks and financial institutions are taking major action over how they are going to reduce the emissions from the financing activities that they undertake. And this is going to drive change amongst SMEs. Now, here's a piece of good news for SMEs, which we are involved with as a British Business Bank. It's a cross-industry collaboration known as Project Perseus, run by Bankers for Net Zero. And the aim is to be able to provide to small businesses an easy, frictionless way of measuring their Scope 1 and 2 emissions based on sort of a combination of open banking technology and smart meter technology and various other things. So this will be developing hopefully during the course of this year and next. But it is recognized that data is a crucial problem and that measuring stuff for small businesses without huge resources is time and resource expensive. So this project is aiming to make that as easy as humanly or perhaps artificially intelligently possible. Final word about, we've talked a lot about carbon, but just to mention here that, environmental, social governance, ESG factors, of course, extend way beyond carbon. And I'm not going to read all of that list out, but I mean, you'll be familiar with many of the issues. All of these issues here, like, for example, I pick out labour standards, zero contracts, product safety. On the governance side, looking at business integrity, ethical leadership practices. All of these, if you're looking at a client or a company, are sources of both opportunity for great business performance and sources of risk that could lead to financial loss. So if you haven't come across these, you will do very soon. The IFRS sustainability standards were released in June, the end of June this year, the first two, Sustainability Standard 1 and 2. And these are going to be setting, of course, for large corporates, listed companies initially, the standards for reporting on the sustainability performance of businesses, carbon emissions, but also general sustainability performance. And I think this is relevant to small businesses for a couple of reasons, as I'll expand on. But the first is that we can expect that this will inform accounting and reporting standards for particularly medium-sized, but also smaller businesses in the future. But also be aware that this is driving what large corporates have to report on, which will then drive their behavior in their own procurement and supply chain. So let's talk about that a little bit more in the final part of the presentation, the impact on small businesses. We did our own research back in late 2021 into where we thought small businesses were. And I don't suppose these numbers have changed hugely. The reality is that most small businesses haven't got a decarbonisation strategy. But encouragingly, quite a lot had actually, when they thought about it, taken at least one action that was aimed at reducing their emissions. So, I mean, this is typical of particularly the smallest businesses. You don't necessarily have a formal strategic, process, but you are taking actions which nevertheless are creating impact. So lots of barriers were cited, similar to the ones at the beginning of the poll. Costs, feasibility, lack of information, lack of finance is also in there. But interestingly, 1 in 5 said that they were prepared to access finance in the next 5 years, specifically for the purpose of improving the sustainability of their business, which is very wise. Now, why what is driving change in SMEs? Well, the people always think, well, government regulation. Yes, that is an important factor, but it absolutely isn't the only one, because what we're finding is that procurement, if you are in a supply chain at the top of which is a Tesco's or a Booker's or any large listed company, really, you will find that increasingly that in order to get a contract as a small business into that supply chain, you may have to start reporting your carbon. You may need to start to report on other ESG factors. You may need to be demonstrating that you have good levels of sustainability in your business in order to keep ahead of your competitors and win those contracts. Consumers are demanding more. Employees is interesting. There's a recent poll that said 1 in 5 employees would not consider working for a firm that didn't prioritize sustainability. And although the poll didn't dig into who those 1 in 5 were, I'm going to hazard a guess that those 1 in 5 are some of the brightest and youngest people in the workforce that you as an employer should not be missing out on just because you haven't paid enough attention to sustainability. Energy and fuel costs almost could be in the first thing I said. I mean, the disruption to energy supplies and costs that came from Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a stark illustration of how dangerous it can be to have a business model that is very reliant on high fossil fuel inputs. So decarbonizing, changing a business model to get rid of those is a really smart business idea, just from a cost point of view. And then, with them, as I said, we may see more incentives like the current incentives, for example, for adopting electric vehicles as a business car, much more tax efficient than internal combustion. So there's lots of drivers of change for SMEs to think about decarbonisation. Here is the standard way of thinking from the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is the benchmark for disclosure about climate-related risks, talking about the risks and the opportunities associated with climate change. And again, I'll just pick out a couple because they distinguish between the physical risks, disruption from weather events, either in the short term, acute weather events, or indeed longer term change that might change the availability of water or the ability to grow crops, for example, and can change supply change dynamics. A survey showed that of 1,000 global cities, 80% of them are already being impacted in serious ways by the physical changes in climate. So this is happening now. And then there's what's known as transition risks. So these are risks that your business model basically doesn't keep up with the change in the economy as it moves towards a decarbonized model. So this is the risk that your business is the next Kodak or the next Blockbuster, because you've remained stuck in a sort of, a business model that hasn't moved, hasn't adopted new clean technologies, hasn't thought about products and services which are going to thrive in a low carbon economy. But there are opportunities, as I say, because if you're ahead of the curve and you get these right, then there's all sorts of opportunities for higher business growth by getting there first, really, on taking the opportunities from a more sustainable, lower carbon economy. I'm not sure my clicker is. Oh, here we go. Priority areas for SMEs. So here's a list again, which I'm going to leave you with because there's a lot of detail on here. But really, I think quite reasonably, a lot of business owners or indeed people advising them might say, well, that's all very well, but in practice, what can we do right away that's going to be useful? So I think it's useful to think about 3 buckets as the place to start: energy efficiency, your premises, the equipment in the premises, if you're a manufacturer in particular, but anything from sunbed machines to photocopiers, there will be a more efficient version of that available. So concentrate on buildings and kit. And then you can think about business vehicles, an obvious one, and travel. A lot of people have already started taking action on this, but whether it's going to electric vehicles or just finding ways of avoiding business mileage in the way you do stuff, that obviously is a good place to start and will cut costs. And then production processes, which is maybe looking at different materials, redesigning products, again, is a good place to prioritize in terms of decarbonisation and improving the business, hopefully the cost dynamics of the business. And so I'm going to finish off now with just 3 pointers of where you can find advice, where small businesses can find advice on how to set about all of this. The first, the UK Business Climate Hub here. It's recently been launched as a collaboration that's backed by the UK government. Lots of great information on here and ideas and pointers for SMEs about how to decarbonise their business. There's also Ofgem, focusing specifically on energy efficiency and what to do about that. Has some great advice for businesses on how they can cut their energy bills. So that's super relevant. It's going to be as relevant this winter as it was last winter, it seems. So that is well worth checking out. And then last, but hopefully not least, we also do on our own website have a whole business information hub, which isn't just about sustainability. It's all sorts of business advice for SMEs, but there is a section in there all about sustainability and how to become a more sustainable business. So please do have a look at that yourselves for your own businesses and point your clients towards that. And so I'll leave it there and just say thanks very much for listening and look forward to some questions later.
Brilliant. Many thanks, Tony. Lots to take away there. As you see, lots of very rich resources to enjoy at our leisure. Climate is just such a nasty risk and worry these days, particularly when you look even most recently at Libya and the damage from the rains there. However, I was very pleased to see the moments or the parts of optimism in your remarks there regarding more cash becoming available, and then also the opportunities of climate. But let me come back to all of this. I've got a few questions I've got from your remarks, but we'll save them for later. Now maybe we'll transition to Craig. Just to go back to what ICAS is about, we basically train chartered accountants and then help chartered accountants stay qualified and then also have a voice in shaping the profession. So we're very much trying to change what we are doing by embedding sustainability throughout our curriculum for students, helping our qualified accountants stay qualified, and embedding sustainability, or giving them options rather of sustainability courses for CPD and that kind of thing. But then also in the operations side of ICAS's business, we are trying to also decarbonise how we operate. And it's my pleasure to bring in Craig now, my colleague, who, as I say, is the guru on this topic for ICAS. So if I may hand over to you, Craig.
Thanks, Fiona, and thanks, Tony, for your presentation. That was really interesting. Having a slight issue with my clicker for the internet here, but oh no, that's perfect. Okay, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, what I was going to do was just kind of talk you through how ICAS, how we kind of approached our net zero strategy and how we had to kind of look at our own net zero roadmap. So in developing that, we first had to establish where we were at that time. We had for a number of years been reporting on our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions through the Carbon Disclosure Project to one of our main customers, and had in the last few years started to add some Scope 3 information around business travel and around waste figures, but we hadn't really gone into much else as we just didn't have the data. So in late 2021, 2022, we engaged the services of an environmental consultant to help us to establish what our baseline figure was for 2021 and to help to guide us through a process to develop our own net zero roadmap. So what we ended up doing was, as you can see on the screen here, we developed a 5-stage plan. So stage 1 was to identify the key Scope 3 emission categories for ICAS. So to do this, what we did was we pulled together a group of people from across the organisation who were key to knowing what their department did and how they went about doing it. So the categories that we decided were key for our process covered things like purchase goods and services, business travel, use and end of life of sold products, as well as commuting and home working. Obviously, this was in 2021 or into 2022, looking back at the 2021 figures. So once we'd decided on these main sources of emissions, what we did was we moved on to stage 2 in this process, and we set about establishing processes for how we would gather the data that we needed, and of course deciding what the best data source we had was available. And this is an area that is improving all the time. For example, travel companies and taxi firms, things like that, can often give you exact emission figures. However, at that point in time, much of the information that we had was based on the pounds spent on goods and services, and that included our streaming services, as we had at that time moved all of our teaching to online because of the pandemic. So once we'd gathered all of the data, we sent this to our climate metrics consultants, who we've been using for over 10 years. And they then use various conversion factors to work out what the greenhouse gas emissions are for all of the data sources that we supplied. And that gave us our carbon baseline figure for 2021. Next slide. So at stage 3, oh sorry, go back to the previous slide. I'm jumping ahead of myself there. At stage 3 of the process, the group from ICAS got together again to consider what we could do to reduce the emissions over time. And all ideas were considered, and then we moved on to stage 4 of this process, where we looked at all of the possible measures and made decisions about which ideas that we had would generate the greatest reductions for the effort needed to achieve them. And then at stage 5 of the process, where we find ourselves now, we're looking at the ways that we can report our strategy to a wider audience, as we're doing right now. Next slide, please. So just on the left, as a brief reminder, Tony showed something similar early of what the 3 emissions categories are. And on the right, if you can see that, that's the emission categories that ICAS identified under our scopes 1, 2 and 3. So the gas, the electricity for 1 and 2, and then the scope 3, a whole variety of different topics that we decided to focus on. Next slide, please. So based on the various categories that we had identified and the conversion factors provided by our consultants, we calculated that our total baseline figure for 2021 was 1,368 tonnes of CO2 equivalent, covering all of the greenhouse gases. So as you can see, our scope 1 emissions accounted for 6.1% of all our total emissions. And the scope 2 emissions, because we switched several years ago to 100% renewable sources of electricity, your scope 2 emissions are actually 0, although there are some related scope 3 emissions for transmission and distribution losses down the line, but the actual scope 2 emissions is 0. So the rest of our emissions, nearly 94%, relate to the scope 3. And of that, 76.5%, over 3/4 of our emissions, related to purchased goods and services. And that was quite an eye-opener for us. Move on to the next slide, please. So with the help of our consultants, we then worked out that in order to try and stay in line with the 1.5 degree limit by 2030, we would need to reduce our emissions against our baseline figure by 38% by 2030. And this is a huge challenge for any business, but this is what will be required to do. And we, like everyone else, you know, we're going to need to look at all the ways we can try to achieve that. Next slide, please. So I suppose it's important first to acknowledge that and accept that you can't do everything immediately or do it all at once. So we've identified the 5 key areas that we're focusing on to affect change for ICAS. So the first is delivering net zero with third parties in our supply chain. This will be a significant piece of work. It is quite a time-consuming and labour-intensive thing to do, but it could prove to be extremely worthwhile in terms of improving the data. For example, as I said, some of the larger suppliers may in fact be able to provide raw data in terms of emissions that may actually prove to be significantly lower than those that you calculated using the pounds spent as a data source. So it is something that is improving all the time, and more businesses recognise the need to calculate their own emissions and to have a plan to reduce them over time. And I think this is what Tony was mentioning as well. It's about, once you're in a supply chain, your suppliers, but also your customers, everybody's looking for better information and more accurate information. So the second area for our focus is our estate, and we're looking at a number of things, including reducing our own office footprint in terms of the space that we occupy, and we're already making changes to the way that we deliver our services, which will allow us to achieve this. We're also looking at things like the heating and lighting in our offices, as well as engaging with staff through various platforms and methods to try and encourage them and hopefully excite them about what we're doing and persuading them to play their part, whether that's in the office or at home. We then have business travel and commuting, which of course includes home working, which is a big factor, I think, in a lot of businesses these days that we didn't really have so much before. So we're introducing an active and sustainable travel policy, and we acknowledge that obviously some business travel is always going to be necessary, but establishing a kind of hierarchy of travel to try and encourage people to always use, if they have to travel, to use the most energy efficient method of transport. So we're also engaging staff to think about what they can do in terms of greener travel to and from work, and what they can do at home to reduce their emissions. For example, they could switch to a renewable energy tariff for their electricity at home, and that would also then reflect on the home working figures that we've worked out for ICAS. For students' travel and study routine, we're looking at the digitalisation of study materials, which is already well underway, and the schedules of in-person learning against remote or on-demand access to lectures and study groups. And the last focus area for now is around responsible procurement. Like everything else, there's a tricky one to balance the need for products against the price and the impact on the climate. However, there are some things that are quite easy to do, as Tony was mentioning as well, like using companies that have a strong commitment to reducing their impact on the environment. You know, some of the airline companies are better than others, and even steps like reducing the number of deliveries to your office by buying in bulk, or using companies that use electric vehicle fleets can make a difference to your own net zero or your own carbon footprint. The only other activity noted on this is a decarbonisation of the grid, which of course is out with our control, but over time should help to reduce everyone's emissions. And so that's a whistle-stop tour of the ICAS net zero journey so far. Hopefully some of you have found that useful, and of course there's still a long way to go, but taking these first steps is possibly the hardest part. And if there isn't the resource or expertise in-house, there are lots of people out there and organisations who can help you to get on your way, on your own net zero pathway. Back to Fiona.
Magic. Thanks, Craig. That was brilliant. I think I learn a new detail every time you share the story so far with me. So thank you very much. I just wonder, what do you wish you had known at the beginning of ICAS's net zero journey that you now know? What is that, a wee gem that you could share? Because I see from our poll at the beginning, 1/5 of the respondents were saying they just don't know where to start. So what's your...
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing there is the level of help that's actually out there. There's lots of information, lots of help, and lots of organisations and businesses, obviously, that can help you. It is quite daunting when you're looking at this. Scope 1 and 2 emissions are relatively easy to calculate, because you can do it by number of kilowatt hours, and you can get that information from your suppliers. So looking at what that actually means in terms of carbon is a relatively easy thing to try and figure out, especially if you use a consultant to do it, as we have done. But I think it's knowing that there is a lot of help out there, and I think I wish I had known just how much assistance, because as I say, I know from my own point of view, it's not necessarily what my background was doing this. I'm facilities and health and safety. So this is kind of, it was a new thing for me. And I think just the level of help and just try and stay calm about it and just kind of look at it in a measured way and take steps, baby steps, if you need to try and move forward.
Fantastic, thank you. And that's the thing, isn't it? It's lots of wee things that are going to make a big difference in this work. So thank you for that. And again, everyone, just to encourage you to download this deck and actually look into the links that we will share with you. Now, we have got a couple of absolute doozers of questions here, Tony. So I hope you are ready for these. They're absolute belters. There's one question here, which it's a fascinating one to me as well. So the question is a focus on growth compatible with a net zero economy?
Yeah, that is a great question. It's one which I'm going to slightly dodge, in the sense that I can point back to the Sustainable Development Commission report in 2009, which released a report named Prosperity Without Growth, authored by Professor Tim Jackson, which first sort of looked into the idea of actually GDP growth isn't the right target anyway, and that we can improve people's lives and enjoy a more prosperous and higher well-being quality of life without actually necessarily growing the economy. But life isn't quite that simple, and a lot of things depend on GDP growth, like tax revenue and so on. So I think what I would say about that question is that I've been involved in this field for quite a long time as an economist, and that it was a question which wasn't really allowed to be debated, and now it is. The European Parliament recently, European Commission, hosted a conference that didn't use the word degrowth, but it was basically all of the academic research that showed how in practice you could deliver better lives with less, with smaller economies, essentially in the rich world, to give space for the poorer countries in the world to grow their economies more so that they can become rich. And I think it's become a live debate. But the reason I'm going to dodge it is that in many senses, a lot of the actions we need to take are the same either way. I think it's a really interesting intellectual question, but when it comes down to practical action, greening the economy is something which both sides of that debate could agree on a lot of the concrete actions on anyway. So there's a large element that says we just need to get on and do what we can as quickly as possible.
Because I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's yes, you want to grow innovation, grow the application of technologies we know, but not maybe just chasing the one financial number and the upward trend of that. I think it's maybe down to definitions as well, but the degrowth movement is certainly a very interesting one. Now I've got another equally macro one for you here. Hold on to your seat, Tony. So my question is in relation to measures being carried out by USA and China. Do we also have a consensus with other countries, as we are already witnessing some of the physical threats?
Well, I mean, that's again a good question. It's possibly one that's slightly above my pay grade, but I would observe, I suppose, as a sustainability professional, that a lot rests on international agreement. Clearly, the climate is a global resource and it needs global action to be able to tackle it. And that's what the COP, the next one is COP28, the 28th Meet Conference of Parties of international countries. And, it's not as fast as people like me would like, but at least there has been progress. And particularly Paris 2 years ago did make some concrete progress towards getting countries to agree on action. I think what I would say, I pointed to this earlier on with the question of growth. I think if we could resolve the tension between poorer countries in the world that have not been the ones that have stuffed all the carbon up into the air, that's been us, that's been the rich countries. And so there's a basic social justice issue that needs to be resolved. And there's a huge amount of investment that needs to take place where we have all the money, even though it doesn't feel like we do, certainly our financial systems do, that could be helping to invest in decarbonisation in less developed countries. And I think if we could get that right, then I think things could really move very quickly.
Great. I think that's it's the whole systems thinking, isn't it? Your role in the value chain and your pull through and your selections and what you do upstream and downstream from your business is key. And this is a beautiful segue into another question we've had. You mentioned procurement pressures as one of the drivers for change in SMEs. Is there evidence of that really happening now from the bank's perspective?
Yeah, I feel John M's pain there. I was also on the Sustainability Advisory Committee of the Upstart Institute south of the border, because I'm also a chartered accountant, and wasn't quite 50, about 10 years ago. I think this time it is driving change, and I think that what's different now to 10, 15 years ago is a number of things. It is the requirement of large corporates to not just report through the Task Force Climate-Related Financial Disclosures regime, and now the new sustainability standards. So now they've got to report, and as we know, what gets measured gets managed, and what gets reported to your shareholders becomes important. And allied to the fact that of setting science-based targets, as Craig was explaining about the targets and the pathway for ICAS, about how it's going to meet net zero, large companies are also doing that. So before there weren't those actual concrete sort of targets, metrics, the data, the reporting, institutional shareholders increasingly looking and, pricing in a premium or a discount to companies depending on their sustainability performance. These are all much more powerful economic drivers that weren't really around 10. It was more based on ethical business practices 10 or 15 years ago, which had some effect in some companies, but didn't. To go system-wide, you really need to get it into the profit and loss incentives, really, and then it really, really does drive change. And I think that's where we are now.
So for SMEs that maybe haven't done an awful lot of activity yet regarding decarbonising, they could expect to be asked for these details by their clients if they've not already been asked.
Well, I think it was, again, Craig's numbers for ICAS was super interesting, because the British Business Bank, we've just done our similar exercise, and ignoring the financed emissions, which is a whole another kettle of fish that you need to do another webinar on, but ignoring that, our biggie was purchased goods and services as well. And we've got over 200 suppliers that we have procurement processes through. So, we are now asking more questions about the sustainability performance of those suppliers and their products. And if we can find a better product, we'll move to a better product. It's happening. And one thing I would say, just to check on that, is that I'm always conscious when we use the phrase SME, that there's a whole world of difference between medium-sized and larger small businesses and micro enterprises and self-employed. And I think for a lot of the 5.5 million SMEs across the whole of the UK, we have to accept that millions of them are very, very small businesses that essentially they might be able to decarbonize their travel or get some better computers. But there's not a huge amount those guys can do. But where it's focused in the larger businesses that are in those supply chains, they do have opportunities. And what I would say is, I know some people might say, well, we've heard it before and it didn't happen, like John's true example there. But you are in danger of missing out to your competitors if you don't get ahead of the game on this.
Yeah, and it's even if you don't want to measure your own emissions for your own knowledge and directed activity, then you're going to have to measure them for your supply chain partners. I think this is the worry, like it's coming your way basically, whether you like it or not in some ways. Yeah.
Well, and just to add to it's coming your way, like it or not, but as I hinted earlier on, it's not just going to be about carbon. Plastics is an increasing issue. So, what are you doing on your packaging? Can you improve the performance of that waste? All the whole sort of water usage.
I was going to say the whole biodiversity piece. Yeah, that's another webinar.
Well, and Microsoft recently released its sustainability report, and people have already poured through the figures of that and asked why there's a 34% jump in water consumption. That's to cool all the servers that are running ChatGPT. And basically, they reckon that depending on where you are in the world, but if you ask ChatGPT a series of between 5 and 50 questions, but it can be as few as 5, it will drink half a litre of water in the course of answering those questions, because that's how much the cooling consumption, water consumption is required to deliver this seemingly carbon-free, service we're enjoying, what lies behind that is a whole host of environmentally impactful processes as well.
And then we won't even talk about Bitcoin mining either in the same vein, but it's messier than maybe it would appear. So, I mean, earlier you mentioned there's 3 buckets of things that companies could look at, energy efficiency, travel and production processes. But, if you are, a service industry, as many are in Scotland, what really, what do you do? Where do you get started? It's just, what's the most efficient use of limited resources, cash and time?
Well, you may be, to be honest, it may well be that if you are a services company, you're in the, our survey, we figured out that we think that over 90% of emissions from SMEs come from just 1 in 4 companies. So those are ones which, and you can guess why, they're the ones that are focused in sectors which are more, manufacturing, or, ones which, which naturally are more physically based. And it's the larger ones quite often, which have large scale operations. So without saying that, if you're a smaller company and you're a services company, you don't need to do anything. Actually, I think in a way you've probably got the easiest job, because and if you're not already, you can do what ICAS have done, and you can eradicate your scope 2 emissions by moving to a zero carbon renewable energy producer. You could certainly look at your purchased goods and services, because those will be significant. And in the same way that some airlines are better than others, some laptop equipment suppliers are better than others, and so it goes on. So there's just when you're making those key business decisions about what you're buying and or even how you're going to deliver your services, how you organize your work and your employees, think carbon, think costs as well, because the two will go together.
Brilliant. Well, listen, we have got loads of questions coming through. I am sorry that we've not managed to get through all of them, and not got through any of mine either, but I've managed to weave you my way slightly without you knowing, Tony. But thank you so much, gentlemen. It's been really, really interesting. Once again, a chat around climate change that could go on for the full day, but we have to kneecap our time right now. So thank you very much. Thank you to the audience for joining us today. We have just some closing thoughts. I mean, basically start now. Consider what your business does and how it does it. I think there's really no, it's an urgent issue, and we really all have to reflect hard and try to make changes now. As I say, it's all about an awful lot of small changes, and sadly there is no magic wand. I think if we can all just make lots of small differences, then accumulatively they will make a huge difference. And there is an awful lot of financial and other support available, some of which you will get through looking in the links that we'll provide you in this deck. So here are some of the links that will come to you in the deck when you download it. This is ICAS material, some articles, a survey, and further courses that you can take. The first course is a beginner's course that's available for ICAS members at no charge. And then we've got other 2 CPD modules there. And there we've got more information sources for the latest from our side of things. So thank you very much again for all your contributions today. Your support, gentlemen, has been great. Attendees, you will be receiving a feedback form from us tomorrow, I believe. So do let us know your feedback on the session, and we would look forward to welcoming you on again on another seminar in due course. Okay, thank you.